Welcome everyone to my first video lecture on classical French philosophy. We'll begin with Thomas Aquinas, who of course wasn't French but was from the south of Italy, but wrote some of his most important works in Paris, where I am today as well. And if you'd like to support the channel in any way you can, then please do so by there'll be several links down there, one to Patreon, one to PayPal, etc. So thank you very much for supporting the work here on this channel. I'm going to be introducing De Ente et Essentia, Das Seiende und das Wesen by Thomas Aquinas, on being and on essence. Now, Aquinas, as I said, was Italian, but he studied in Paris under Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. He went with him to Cologne, but he returns in 1252 to Paris. And the Ente et Essentia, the work we'll be introducing today, was written in 1254 to 56, and it was presumably the first genuine writing by Saint Thomas. It's dedicated ad fratres socios, that is to his Dominican patres, and at the Paris Saint Jacques Stift. So we are going to discuss not the entirety of the book, but focus on the notion of humanitas, or humanity, in Aquinas. And I think that the book, is fair to say that what it is an introduction for his fellow patres to his thought, and for himself an exercise to get clear on his own concepts and metaphysics in his reading of Aristotle especially. So, according to Thomas Aquinas, humanity is distinction and demarcation against deity and angels. Humanity is a composite of rationality and animality, and as such it serves to provide the formal unity of the human. In On Being and Essence, the Ente et Essentia, humanitas is the essence as substantial form of an individual human being. Essence, in the proper sense for Aquinas, designates a composition of substances. Insofar as, formally speaking, and hence without individuating matter, humans are animals with the distinguishing and active principle of rationality. The soul of a human being is the intrinsic ground or cause of that particular human being. Rationality is the distinguishing and as such active principle, letting the human being transcend pure animality. So it's crucial that when we hear that humanitas is a composite of animalitas and rationalitas, while this could easily sound as though this is an external representational way of thinking of humanity, it's composite, two parts put together, two substances formed into one, it's important to understand, as Aquinas himself points out, that it's an active principle, just as humanity is, instead of just something externally attached to something else. So rationality is an active principle that is only an acting, as it were, that distinguishes the human being then from a pure animality. So it's not an animal part that has a rational part attached to it, as in the animal rationalis is often related, but instead the rationality is the active principle in that specific animality of humanity that makes the human being a specific or distinct kind of animalitas, which is not to be conflated, by the way, also with just animal. So it's not to say we are an animal that is also rational, any of this, or this nonsensical way of, what do people say today? Non-human animals, completely meaningless categories. So again, that specific animalitas of humanitas is a specific one that is only can only be related to through that active principle of rationalitas. And humanity makes no sense without those two coming together as one in principle. Humanity, however, for Aquinas, is the essence of the human being in a formal sense. The individual human being is not addressed by it. That's important to note. So yes, humanitas is that by which the human is human. In Latin, id unde homo est homo, chapter 2. Still, humanitas is the essence of the human only in formal terms. That is to say, unbounded by the limitations and particular individuations of the material. Hence, Thomas argues, quote, humanity is not the human being. One cannot say Socrates is humanity. One can only say Socrates is a human being. Succinctly put, humanity is an abstract part of the universal. Itself not a universal, and on its own, humanity does not address the concrete individual human being, and certainly does not give a response to the question who the human being is. Thus, references to humanity today, when we hear them today, do not address the totality of humankind, but the abstract part of the universal, which without material individuation does not say much about human being in its actuality. Which is something we won't touch on really here today, but one of the main issues for Aquinas is the question of the principle of individuation. How can there be a soul that is immortal, that is at the same time individual, when the material body is itself finite, so that the soul is only individuated really when it is inside a body that is finite? We will see this problem resurface several hundred years later with Descartes, which will be the second lecture of this series on Descartes' Meditations, where he tries to prove the immortality of the soul. It's a mistake to read Descartes as a purely modern thinker who invents subjectivism or anything like this, as Heidegger did, which is wrong. Heidegger misreads Descartes. Right? He reads him only from his perspective. But Descartes responds to thinkers like Aquinas. And Aquinas is a thinker that, for example, is unknown to Heidegger. He knows Aquinas, but Heidegger does not think in terms of principles. So he thinks in a very external way. So this is why you get from Heidegger, you get these notions that a rational animal is just this external composite, which it isn't. It's a composite, but it's a symphony that composes itself, as it were, in its activity. So a superficial understanding of humanity today might even consider humanity purely as an abstraction without the individual, and wrongly hypostatize a most general humanity with certain features such as language as communication, thinking as computation, the mind as the brain, etc., etc. So we can learn from Aquinas that while humanitas is needed as a substantial form in the individual to make the individual human, humanity on its own is nothing. Aquinas is certainly aware of this threat and of the misleading powers of abstraction, while abstraction, of course, is necessary, as was his teacher Aristotle. In Book 7 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, we find an early warning against the powers of abstraction. While it is possible to reduce everything to form, this leads to anaporia, a paradox. Aristotle writes, quote, "To reduce everything in this way and to dispose of matter is going too far, for it leads one away from the truth and makes one suppose that it is possible for a man to exist without his parts, as a circle does without the bronze." End of quote. So, in Aquinas, of course, we still have this strong sense of a Christian metaphysics that undergirds and nurtures everything. Hence, there is less of a threat of this turning into a pure, universalized abstraction. So, what perhaps in closing one should say, or I should point out, is that in this book we find Aquinas' attempt to bring to the fore, or to articulate for himself, what he means by being and what he means by essence in how he distinguishes himself from other commentators, for example, Avicenna, of Aristotle. And also he is, and I won't go into the usual story of nominalism, realism, universalism debate, etc. But instead, you can see, without going there even, that he's struggling, I think, to a certain degree with language. In fact, with the Latin language, which would have been very close to his mother tongue, Italian. But still, as he's reading Aristotle in Latin translation, I think what he's struggling with is trying to make sense of essentia, substantia, of the metaphysical concepts in a way so that they don't become, as I said before, when we speak in terms of, for example, of humanitas, so that they don't become mere abstractions, but that they are concretized in concrete living individuals. And also that he sees, I think, the threat that a metaphysical language could become purely external and really just look at the human being as an animal that is also rational, but no longer understands or is able to think in terms of principality, in terms of principles that are enacting themselves, that are active, as it were. So that the threat really is in language to think of substances as composites, being put together as different particles, while what language has to achieve is, without hypostasis, being able to articulate the activity of those principles, which without activity are not those principles. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And if you'd like to support the channel any way you can, then please do so. There will be several links in the description of this video. And if you know anyone who's interested in Aquinas, share the video with them and perhaps also leave a comment yourself. Thank you very much.